A personality on Russia's state television has threatened to retaliate against any aggression by the U.S. by nuking the U.S. directly. There's a bunch of arguments here. Perhaps the argument is it's just some guy on TV and what does it matter? The other argument is this is how the Kremlin sends out its messages. You have a prominent personality on TV saying to the United States that in the event of the U.S. escalation of war with Russia, Russia will not respond in Europe, but will respond by nuking the United States. At the same time, North Korea has warned that the United States should understand the real devastation of nuclear war and has run a simulated nuclear explosion. I know a lot of people are already going to respond to this, saying, it's nonsense, nothing's going to happen, they're saber rattling. Let me slow you down there, my friends. Perhaps you're correct. Perhaps nothing will come of this. It's silly nonsense. A guy on TV says they're going to nuke us. He's not the Kremlin. He's not Putin. Well, Vladimir Putin said he would use tactical nuclear weapons, like the recently deployed for combat duty Sarmat, also known by the media as the Satan II missile, a multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle, or MIRV for short, which can drop a plethora of warheads and just bombard several cities with one ICBM, that is intercontinental ballistic missile. Perhaps nonsense. Perhaps they want to scare the public. Perhaps the reason Newsweek is reporting this is because they want the American people all riled up saying, we got to stop Vladimir Putin. Whatever, man. Let me tell you this. It's all grains of sand. You do not go from one day, we are sending weapons to Ukraine, and then the next day, Russia has fired a nuclear weapon which is about to slam into civilian targets in the United States. I really don't think that's going to happen. It's tactically stupid, in my opinion, for a variety of reasons we'll get into. But understand, when we read history, it is condensed. It's like you read a paragraph about a particular aspect of the war, and they're years apart. You read about the Boston Massacre. You read about the Boston Tea Party. Like, what are they, like 3 years apart? So when all of this stuff is going down, it is just incremental. But in the history books, it's a straight line. Now, again, maybe it doesn't go anywhere. Maybe come November, Trump gets reelected and he says, we're shutting this down, no more war, and then it's all over. And that's it. And then the war fizzles. I think if Donald Trump gets reelected, there is a strong probability war ends overnight. Probably should say that with figuratively to a degree, I don't know what speed by which war happens, but I believe that as soon as Trump gets reelected, as soon as they announce on TV Trump is the president, you'll probably hear some kind of ceasefire or calls for one at the very least. Here's the news from Newsweek.com. Russian state TV threatens nuclear strike on the United States. Civilian targets, nonetheless. A Kremlin propagandist has issued the latest nuclear threat against the West regarding the war in Ukraine, warning the U.S. could be in danger of a Russian missile attack. Igor Korotchenko, editor of the newspaper National Defense and a regular guest on the Russia One channel, where guests have repeatedly called for strikes against Ukraine's allies, took exception to criticism of Russia's conduct in the war. He goes on to say that, look, basically, NATO keeps saying this stuff. The U.S. keeps saying, if Russia does this, if Russia does that. And his response was, oh, yeah? How do we respond? What if the U.S. does this? How will we respond? Korotchenko believed these were not just statements of a retired war hawk, he said, but also a concerted information campaign designed to influence both us and a Western audience. While the U.S. is the biggest political provider of military aid to Ukraine, it has taken pains to avoid direct confrontation with Russia and has made no threats of attacking the targets that Korotchenko referred to. Right now, it is but a gentleman's game. Russia knows we're at war with them and using Ukraine as a proxy, but it's in the best interest strategically to try and win before the escalation grows outside of Ukraine. But in the event Russia begins to lose, which I don't see an off-ramp, then it gets gnarly. It gets crazy. Check this out. He said, in response to your attacks on Russian military or civilian facilities, the first strike will be a preventative, limited strike against targets on the territory of the United States of America. The most important message we should send to the Americans is that we will not wage war with you in Europe. And then he follows up, it will be an attack on the United States of America. That's right. A Russian propagandist, Russian media personality, whatever you want to say. Attention, United States. He wrote Gerashenko. Gerashenko next to the video. Russian propagandists threatened with nuclear strikes on U.S. territory. In response to Korchenko's comments, Hodges told Newsweek that the U.S. administration was finally realizing that the likelihood of Russia using nuclear weapons is extremely small. Russia has been threatening nuclear strikes since the beginning. I take them seriously because Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons and because they clearly don't care how many innocent people may die. But I think they realize that their nukes are actually most effective when they don't use them. They see how we self-deter. Crimea is the decisive terrain for this war, says Hodges of the peninsula, which has seen stepping up attacks. Once Ukraine liberates Crimea, it is over. Ukraine knows they cannot ever be safe or secure or rebuild their economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea. I do not believe Russia is likely to nuke the United States. I think it's a possibility, but I just don't see it really happening. Why? Mutually assured destruction, as they describe it, is, in my opinion, exaggerated. And I would go as far as to hyperbolically say nonsense. Now, here's what I mean to say. If Russia, for some reason, fires a Satan II rocket, which they recently deployed, at, I don't know, D.C. or New York City, which makes literally no tactical sense, economic sense, military sense, then sure, the U.S. will fire back. But why? In the event that Russia launches one missile, would anyone else launch missiles? Right? So take a look at these. These videos are pretty cool. This is what footage shows Russia's new super weapon, Sarmat. It's scary. It's scary stuff. Intercontinental ballistic missile. I believe the Sarmat has a range of 11,000 miles. Carries, 10 thermonuclear warheads. Very interesting. A 3-stage liquid-fueled rocket. And that's what we think we know about it. Why would Russia tell us? Well, perhaps the argument is right. They are better off saber-rattling than actually using their weapons. I'd be willing to bet Russia's got other capabilities we don't know about. I would not be surprised if we've already been hit by Russian and Chinese military-grade cyber attacks. But let's go back to the missile question. For what purpose does Russia have to fire a missile on New York or Omaha or, I don't know, Dayton, Ohio? Literally none. What advantage do they gain? Look, if we had centralized manufacturing in the Rust Belt, okay, maybe that makes sense. Take out our manufacturing capabilities. But manufacturing for the US is all over the place now and barely in the United States. What does a nuke accomplish? A threat? Maybe Russia launches a smaller yield nuke at a civilian target for some reason. I don't see what they gain from it. I don't. Now, if they use a nuke in Europe, that makes sense, especially in Ukraine. They could damage or destroy weapons and they could irradiate certain areas and make no man's land. That makes sense. Russia might say, in order to stop the advancement of NATO forces, which they consider Ukraine to be, they use smaller yield nukes near their border, which creates no man's territory. And so it stops the advance. That makes sense. Nuclear artillery. If Russia fires any nukes at the United States, the U.S. supposedly fires a bunch of nukes back. So here are the questions I have. What is the gain of the United States or any nation to retaliate by firing its nukes back at the other country? A deterrent? The threat that you nuke us, we nuke you back prevents you from nuking us. Don't know if I believe it. There's that famous story, I don't know how true it is, where the guy in the submarine gets the warning saying that U.S. fired a nuke and he doesn't push the button because he's like, I'm not sure. They called him a hero. The story's more complicated than that. I don't know. I'm probably missing some of the details. But stories like that say to me that this idea that we just all launch nukes at each other makes no sense. We saw this with the G.I. Joe movie. Yeah, I know movies aren't real life. My point is, this is the trope, right? The bad guy comes in and he's like, we're firing a nuke. So they all start firing nukes at each other. Why? If Russia nukes the United States, does it trigger NATO Article 5? So then NATO countries nuke Russia. So then China intervenes and nukes Europe. Is that supposedly what's going to happen? You know what I think is really more likely to happen? Russia fires a nuke at the United States. The U.S. institutes some kind of air defense dome system with firing counter missiles to take it out in the sky. or laser systems along the coast probably have some capabilities to do so. And in the event a nuke does touch down and cause massive damage to the U.S. then calls upon the international community to immediately seize and sanction everything within Russia to remove them from power to prevent World War III. I don't see anybody nuking civilian targets. Just doesn't make any sense to me. But more importantly, I think that the main issue is there's nothing to be gained from doing it. If this guy's telling the truth, we will nuke U.S. territory. Why? What does Russia win? You don't win anything. You don't gain any strategic control. You don't disrupt our military in any meaningful way. It's nonsense. Now, if they were to fire a Sarmat 2 and take out, say, like a Hawaiian base, which could disrupt our ability to, or Guam or something, it could disrupt our ability to respond to, say, China, maybe that makes more sense. But then it's a military target. I don't see why civilian targets ever make sense. Not to mention, the capabilities of war are probably well beyond what we think we know. They're deploying the Satan II missile? Bah. I bet they've got more strategic weapons that can be more devastating. Russia could cyber attack industrial control systems and disrupt the U.S. economy. The best bet for Russia right now is to disrupt the U.S. economy and our culture. And it seems like that's happening with social media, with young people's brains being rotten and destroyed. To be fair, you take a look at the entirety of the United States system as itself, and it seems to be in serious trouble. The culture war is ripping the country apart. Corrupt Democrats seeking to win re-election are burning the system to the ground. And Republicans are going, slow down there, Democrats. And that's about all we get. So for Russia, they need only say, look, all we got to do is wait. And the U.S. system will rip itself to shreds. If Donald Trump gets reelected, I think this war wraps up really quickly because Trump's not going to stand for it. And there's no benefit for the U.S. other than maintaining some kind of international petrodollar supremacy. There's an alternative to that. It's called a U.S. manufacturing base, secure borders, and enforcing our law and weeding out corruption, having a shared national identity. Shout out to Vivek Ramaswamy. This idea that the United States is some multicultural world police is psychotic and cannot be maintained. So we'll see how this plays out. I think their threats are meaningless for the most part, but take them seriously. Now on Twitter, I said, you are not prepared. And it's funny because most people respond with like, oh boy, this is scary. And then you get a handful of people like, well, you're not prepared either, Tim. Yo, when I said you're not prepared, I didn't say I was. No one knows what would really happen or how it would go down. We can speculate. I will say, I think it's fair to say that I'm more prepared than the average person. And I'm not going to explain how because that compromises security for our emergency operations. But yeah, I don't think anyone's fully prepared for what total nuclear annihilation will look like. Where do they strike if they do? Is it going to be in D.C.? Maybe, maybe not. D.C. is probably one of the most secure areas in the country when it comes to air defense. I bet they got a bunch of laser turret systems and air dome systems we don't even know about. Plus, you got Mount Weather and Raven Rock. Yeah. When started playing Fallout 3 again recently. Real places. And we know the U.S. has been, what are they doing? The renovations on Mount Weather and I think Raven Rock. These are emergency bunkers, but come on. You think we actually know about the emergency bunkers they really have? Sure, some of them, but there's a reason there's classified information. So when it comes to actual full-scale nuclear war, maybe things do get out of hand and the bombs go flying. No one's going to be prepared for what comes next because we just don't know. Where will your food come from? How long will your food last? Most people have prepped for probably only a handful of months if they did. How many preppers have 35 years worth of food? Probably don't. Because you need a lot. But there are some areas that are prepared. We've had the gentleman from Fortitude Ranch on the show. They're disaster preparedness, and it's disaster preparedness. Like they've got underground, protective bunkers and things like that that can withstand serious attacks. But they're more so like man's retreats where it's like you go chop lumber and hunt or something. I don't know. I think they're really cool. For which I am an investor. I'm not going to say that's exactly how we're prepared or anything like that, but it's hard to know exactly how things go down if they do and whether or not you'll be prepared for whatever it is. Where will you get your food? Have you thought about it? What if it's not a nuclear strike? Let's be more realistic. What if it is something more like disruption in trade lines? What if it is strategic insurgent strikes in the United States? Not a nuke, but just one guy who sneaks through the southern border and then massively destroys one highway. Here's the crazy thing. Imagine a handful of highways in the middle of the night are attacked. How much damage that causes economically? A lot. Truckers are not going to be able to get through. Railroads. Think about that. You could have a dozen guys. I talk about this all the time. It doesn't take a lot to throw a wrench in the spokes of a machine. It can take you years to build. Think about it this way. Look at a newspaper printing press, whatever they call it, the printing machine. You got all these papers. They're being mass printed super quick. A machine like that is very complicated. Imagine what happens if you throw a pebble into the gears. That's it. Grinds to a halt, breaks. You don't know where the brake is. It's easy to disrupt the machine. It is hard to build. So when it comes to what's happening internationally with war, I'm not super concerned about watching a nuke explode in the sky or drop a bunch of warheads and just pepper the eastern seaboard. That's bad for Russia. They rely on trade. These economic bonds are important. It's not the worst, mind you, if they're facing an existential threat. But the real targets are going to be military bases. They're going to target, what you want to look for is areas that have strategic military operations. And I won't go off just naming a bunch. There's a handful of very strategic ones. I'll give you one example, though. San Pedro in just south of Los Angeles. I believe it's the biggest. It could be the biggest port of entry for the United States, at least for like transporting from Asia. And there's many ports. You disrupt that, supplies into the U.S. are in serious trouble. You've got the North Dakota. I'll give you another one. North Dakota frac fields where we produce a ton of energy. There are things like that. Now, if a bomb went off there, I'm not super worried outside of D.C. But D.C. is also a major political hub where operations are taking place. Let me just say, you can trust politicians to make sure they are protected. And nobody in Congress or the executive branch wants to be exposed. So, with things like Mount Weather and Raven Rock, we have the forward-facing emergency bunkers. But I'm willing to bet that when it comes to spending money to defend American soil, the ultra-wealthy revolving door political elites have spent a disproportionate amount on themselves and not on critical infrastructure. And thus, critical infrastructure is likely going to be the key target. Severing lines of trade. More importantly, communication is everything. The internet goes down, radio goes down, jamming, whatever you want to call it. That is the quickest and fastest way to disrupt the U.S. So let me put it this way. Will a nuke be falling on your town anytime soon? Yeah, probably not. But I don't know where this goes because we're facing an economic slowdown, crisis, if you would, a political crisis, a cultural crisis, an international crisis. You've got bubbling war with China. We've got U.S. military operations in Australia. That ain't for no reason. China wants to move on Taiwan. North Korea has been issuing threats, but to be fair, they've been issuing threats forever. Russia deploying its new Sarmat, Satan II missile, they call it. Things are getting spicy out there. But I want you all to understand. I was born during the Cold War, and I don't remember much of it at all. I think I vaguely remember something on TV about the fall of the Berlin Wall or something. I don't know. When did the Berlin Wall come down? Let me just double check. Because, I can't remember. It was demolished in 1990. What was it? 1994? Yeah. Wait, what was it? Oh, from 89 to 94. I remember when I was a real little kid, there was something about it, but it's like a vague flash of a memory. I don't even know. During the Cold War, people actually thought they were going to get blown up and that the end was nigh. But just realize this. Back to the Future, that was made during the Cold War. The Bee Gees, Staying Alive, written during the Cold War. The Beatles, pumping out tons of music during the Cold War. So while all of this stuff was happening with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the expansion of communist territory, with Vietnam and all of this stuff, with what was going on with the Korean War, we had a whole bunch of cultural endeavors and life was carried on in the United States. And then ultimately, thankfully, it did not reach nuclear annihilation levels. That doesn't mean it won't. It just means that this talk of war was a lot worse a long time ago. But then again, as things go internationally and nationally, when I ask older people, and for those of you that are older, reading this, comment, have you ever seen it this bad? I have every answer I've gotten. I'm in an antique store, a guy's in his mid-60s. I say, have you ever seen it this bad? He goes, never. And I'm like, what about the Weather Underground? And he was like, no, never seen it this bad. And that's crazy. People like to cite the Weather Underground as if it was but they were bombing stuff. And it's like, yeah, shock and awe campaigns. But we had Antifa ransack and BLM ransacking the entire country in the worst riots in 50 years. We had far leftists firebombing a federal building for 3 months straight. Crazy. So, I mean, what do you think is crazier? Shock and awe campaigns? No, don't get me wrong. The Weather Underground, I think they were robbing a bank. They did kill, there was a security guard, I think it was. You guys correct me on that was one and fill in the blanks. But it's hard to know. How do you compare it? Honestly, I don't have the answers for you. Where we go from here, I don't know. I just think that you guys should prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and don't vote for the warmongers. Yeah. Donald Trump may not be perfect, but if you take a look at his foreign policy, it was slightly better. I suppose you can make the argument that with Trump, we lose the petrodollar and the standard of living in the United States crumbles. Yeah, maybe. But I've never been one to subscribe to the belief that the U.S. should maintain a strong economy by pointing weapons at other nations and being world police. In which case, the idea that we, shore up our defenses, bring our manufacturing base back, secure our borders, is the appropriate way to handle the international conflict. Be responsible for ourselves. There's a fear in Chinese expansion and the communist state, for sure. I don't have all the answers, and maybe I'm naive. I guess we'll see. Next segment's coming up at 6 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.